new report shows the world needs to significantly step up its effort against climate change. It says the vast majority of the pledges countries made under the 2015 Paris Accord aren't nearly enough to keep global warming in check. Well, it ranks nearly three-quarters of the world's carbon emission reduction pledges as insufficient, including those of major polluters such as China, the United States and India. A dozen pledges were judged only partially sufficient, and just under 20% were deemed sufficient, most of them in the European Union. But while the bloc has ambitious enough targets, environmentalists say it's not on track to meet them. Well, to discuss this report in further, which called The Truth Behind the Climate Pledges, I'm joined now by one of its authors, Sir Robert Watson, a former chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as a former White House senior advisor. Oh, thanks for joining us here on the programme. Let me begin by asking you, in your report we see that 60% of the world's worst polluters are China, the EU, India, as well as the United States. And China's pledge is quite interesting because on paper it looks quite ambitious, but in practice you say it's insufficient. So can you explain why?
If we want to achieve the 1.5 degree target set in Paris, then we need global emissions to be reduced by 50% by 2030. While the emissions intensity target of China and India are very good, their economic growth is so strong that their emissions will increase between now and 2030. And therefore, they clearly cannot help to get global emissions to decrease by 50% by 2030.
What sort of impact is the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord going to have now? Is that going to make the world's target impossible?
It will certainly make the world's target harder. At first, the US emissions will not decrease as much as President Obama promised. Secondly, the US has pulled out of funding developing countries to help them meet their targets. And third, as one of historically the largest emitters in the world, and currently one of the highest per capita emissions, it sends a terrible signal to other countries that the US is not committed to addressing the climate issue.
Now, in your report, it seems the EU is a rare bright spot, and before we can start patting ourselves on the back here in Europe, do you think enough is being done here to meet its ambitious targets? I mean, Europe has, after all, pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions by some 40% below their 1990 levels by 2030.
They're clearly in the lead. There's no question at all. Obviously, we need even more from the EU, and by 2050, we need the EU to be carbon neutral. So their pledge for 2030 is very encouraging, but clearly in the EU, we will have to go to carbon neutral by 2050.
Now, EU states member states are calling on the European Investment Bank to block funding for fossil fuel projects. How big a boost could that be for our ambitions here in Europe?
Oh, definitely. It's a step in the right direction. We need to produce our energy much cleaner. We need to move away from fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. And we need to use our energy much more efficiently in cars, buildings, industry. We also need to change our agricultural practices, which also emit greenhouse gases. And in tropical countries in particular, we need to stop deforestation. So anything that helps move us away from fossil fuels is a step in the right direction.